Welcome to my YouTube channel. To all of you, my returning subscribers, thank you very much for your support. And if you are visiting my channel for the first time, please hit the subscribe button, like this video, strike the bell notification so you get alerted as soon as I post any new content. In the last video, we looked at how Entra ID handles passwords. Now, in this video, I'm going to be discussing something very important, and that is multi-factor authentication and conditional access in Microsoft Entra. So, as usual, I'm going to be dropping all of the description down below. If you've got any question, go ahead and drop the question in the comment section, and I'll be doing my best to give you all of the answers. So watch this video to the end and you're going to see everything that we are going to be talking about. I'll be diving into the console where I'm going to be showing you how to implement multi-factor authentication and conditional access in Entra ID. So please stay tuned and watch this video to the end. Thank you very much as you do so. So in this week's video, we are going to be talking about Entra ID, multi-factor authentication, and conditional access. So let us begin. What are we going to be talking about? Well, we're going to define what MFA is. We're going to explain why we need to have MFA in place. We're going to be comparing MFA with 2FA. We'll look at the essentials of MFA and some of the features you need to look out for if you want to adopt it. And then finally, we'll talk about conditional access. So let us get started. So what is MFA? MFA, or multi-factor authentication, is a mechanism requiring users to provide two or more authentication factors in order to validate their identity and gain access to a resource, which could be an application or an online account. It adds an additional layer of protection to resources for which access is requested. And by using multiple factors, MFA provides greater assurance that users are who they are or who they claim to be, therefore reducing the risk of unauthorized access to sensitive data. Now, MFA factors can be knowledge-based, that is something you know. And this could include a PIN or a personally identifiable number, or an answer to a security question. It could be ownership-based, that is something you own, including maybe a device that generates a one-time password, a token, or a smart card, or even a badge. It could be biometric-based, that is something you are, involving biometrics such as facial features, fingerprints, retinal scans, or other unique physical characteristics. So, why do we need MFA in the first place? Well, that is because passwords, being a common means of verifying the identity of users that want access to systems or services, and typically working by comparing a secret value that the user knows, which is the password, with a stored value that the system or service has, that is the password hash. And like we said, passwords are used widely and they are relatively easy to implement. However, passwords alone are no longer sufficient for protecting online resources. This is because as processing capacities have become more powerful and become cheaper, it has also become increasingly easier for passwords to be compromised through cracking. So, password attacks have also become more sophisticated, and threat actors can use many ways, such as brute force attacks or password spraying techniques, to compromise systems. Now, with MFA, each factor then compensates for the weakness of others. For example, you can add an authentication factor that cannot be easily guessed or cracked, like maybe an ownership-based authentication factor. That is something you have, and this is going to be complementing the knowledge-based authentication factor, such as usernames and passwords. Now, MFA used in this way will then enhance the security of the system, and it will do that without having to eliminate the use of passwords. So, what now is the difference between the very well-known and talked about MFA and the not so well-known 2FA? Well, we'll start with 2FA first. Now, 2FA is short for two-factor authentication. And from the name, it takes two factors to identify a user. The first part could be a knowledge-based authentication, such as something you know, maybe a password. And the second part can be something you have, let's say maybe a smartphone or a token that is going to verify the identity of the person that is making claims. Now, the second factor may not necessarily be a physical device. It can be anything that only the person should have access to. A lot of times, users can choose whether they want the second factor to be maybe a code sent to their email address or an SMS message sent to their phones. Some other users could prefer additional security questions that have predefined answers. Now, we could also use a key, and a key is something only the person can access in order to proceed with the authentication. So, implementing the second factor to the user's authentication process is a significant addition to security. That is because it adds an obstacle that is difficult to pass for the threat actor in case of a compromise to the password. Thereby, it significantly enhances security because it will require both something you know, which is the password, and something you have, such as maybe a device that can generate a one-time password. So, it is an important practice for safeguarding sensitive information and preventing unauthorized access. That is because, beside entering a password, users would also provide an additional verification factor that only they possess. For example, after they've entered the password, they are going to receive a unique code on their mobile device, and they will then impute this code to complete the process. But let us take note that while the two-factor authentication is safer than the single-factor authentication, it is not entirely without its own challenges. That takes us to the next type of authentication, which is multi-factor authentication. Now, multi-factor authentication, or MFA, is a term for an authentication method involving the use of many types of knowledge, ownership, and biometric factors. That is because we may choose to maybe write down a password, which is an unsafe practice. Some people could share the password, equally an unsafe practice. Other people may lose their smart cards, or it could be stolen, and sometimes biometric systems could be vulnerable to high error rates or spoofing. So, MFA would go beyond 2FA because it's going to be adding more authentication and verification elements to the process of signing in. Now, this could include biometric data, such as the fingerprint or face recognition, or it could even involve the physical location of the user. For example, let's imagine logging into our bank account, would enter our password, would receive a text message with a code, which is 2FA, and then we would use our fingerprint to verify our identity, which now becomes MFA. So, MFA provides even stronger security by combining multiple factors. So, what are some of the essential features we would be looking out for should we want to implement multi-factor authentication? Now, one of the biggest challenges that's faced by IT departments of organizations that are eager to switch to MFA is deploying it into existing identity environments, especially when that environment would include both an on-premises and a cloud-based scenario. Now, to address this challenge, organizations should always look for an MFA software that's got flexible deployment options. That is, it can be deployed to support both on-premises and cloud-based environments. And this kind of flexibility is going to make deployment a lot easier. Now, we could also have some adaptability that we need to look out for. Now, adaptive multi-factor authentication is an approach combining multiple authentication factors to verify the identity of the user, and it will be going beyond not just the two-factor authentication, but it would include additional layers of security. It would include things like dynamic risk assessment, and it will combine all of these things together to provide a more secure user experience. Another thing we would be looking out for would be an MFA system that supports multiple authentication modes. And this is going to further provide some enhanced flexibility and security for user authentication. That is because it's going to be offering different methods that we can tailor to the user experience and to the user preferences while we are still maintaining a robust security. Now, the MFA solution should also be easy to customize, allowing us to tailor the authentication process to our specific use case. And of course, this flexibility is going to ensure that we can adapt MFA policies as our requirements continue to evolve. And then finally, we will be talking about conditional access. The reality of hybrid work scenarios is that organizational networks and the network perimeters will be extending beyond the traditional brick and mortar network environment. And that is because users should be able to access resources related to their organizations from any device, and this device could be in whatever location that the user is. Now, this reality has prompted organizations to put in place a more robust solution for identity and access management. And this solution should have the capability of utilizing identity based signals as part of their access control system. Now, Microsoft Entra Conditional Access is a classic solution that makes decisions using all of these signals to enforce access control policies. And at the basic level, conditional access are the set of if-then statements that allow users to complete an action if they want access to the resource. As a typical example, if a user wants to access maybe a Microsoft 365 resource, maybe like Teams, then they may be prompted to complete a multi-factor authentication. And some other signals could include things like the user location, the device, and some of the possible actions that the system can carry out could be to allow access, to deny or block access, or to require multi-factor authentication. Now, once this is done, then the user would either be denied access, in which case they will not be able to go further, or they will be allowed access, and then they will be able to use whatever apps or have access to whatever data that the organization possesses. So, in the next part of this video, we are going to be diving into the Entra Admin Console, and then we are going to see how we will be implementing these things that we have discussed. So please stay with us. So we are in the Microsoft Entra console in the admin center here, and we want to begin the process of configuring multi-factor authentication. But before we do that, I want to bring a few things to your attention. The first thing is the licensing requirement. And for you to be able to configure multi-factor authentication, you need to have a premium license. So how do you find out what kind of license you have? One way would be to go to Identity and then click on Overview. And then on the Overview page, you are going to go to the Basic Informations area, and you're going to see the kind of license that you've got. In this case, we have the Microsoft Entra ID P2 license. So we meet that requirement. Now, another requirement that you need to meet would be dependent on the scenario that you want to deploy multi-factor authentication to. And there are actually three possible scenarios. Now, in the first scenario, we have the cloud-only identity environment with modern authentication. And for that scenario, there is currently no additional prerequisite apart from having the appropriate license, which is the Microsoft Entra ID Premium license, which we have met. That is the scenario we are going to be assuming. But there are two other scenarios. The next one is the hybrid scenario. In the hybrid scenario, there is a prerequisite to deploy Microsoft Entra ID Connect, and of course to synchronize user identities between the on-premises Active Directory domain services and Microsoft Entra ID. And there is yet a third scenario where you may have on-premises legacy applications published for cloud access. In that situation, the prerequisite will be to deploy Microsoft Entra ID application proxy. So like I said, we are going to be assuming the very first scenario, and that means we have met all of the prerequisites. So we want to go ahead and begin the configuration for Microsoft Entra multi-factor authentication. So let us begin. So to configure Microsoft Entra ID multi-factor authentication, we'll go ahead and click on identity, and under identity we will expand protection, and after we've expanded protection, we want to go ahead and look at multi-factor authentication. So I'll go ahead and click on show more, and there we are. I'll go ahead and expand, click on multi-factor authentication. So remember, we talked about the scenario here, which is the first one, and we want to just under configure, we want to click on additional cloud-based multi-factor authentication settings. So I'll go ahead and click on the link. And on clicking on the link, another URL it takes us to another URL, and it's going to load a page where we are going to configure some additional settings. So it takes us to the multi-factor authentication user service settings. So we have some areas here, such as the area under app passwords, and the default here is to allow users to create app passwords in order to sign in to non-browser applications. That is currently selected, which is the default. And then under trusted IPs, we have the option to configure trusted IPs, or we have the option also to skip multi-factor authentication from requests from federated users on my intranet. That is currently not checked. And then under verification options, we have methods available to users. We can text message to phones. We can notify through mobile apps. We can send verification code from mobile apps or hardware token. All of those three options are checked. And then the other setting is to remember multi-factor authentication on trusted devices. If we check that, it will allow users to remember multi-factor authentication of devices that they trust, and the number of days we can configure is anywhere between 1 to 365 days. Currently, it is defaulted to, if checked, it defaults to 90 days. But I'm just going to, for the purpose of simplicity, I'm going to allow everything to be the way it is, and then I'll go ahead and click on save. And our settings are being saved, and of course we have configured multi-factor authentication. So I'll go ahead and click on close. All right, so we want to go ahead and configure a conditional access rule for MFA for a specific user to be able to test if a multi-factor authentication configuration actually is working. But before we do that, I want us to check a few things. One of the things I want us to go and look at is to choose a user. So I'll go to identities, users, I'll go to all users, and I want to go and select a particular user. I want to be sure that the user has licenses assigned so that they'll be able to get access to a particular application. So I've selected this user. The username is Grady Archie, and I want to go ahead and click on licenses to see the kind of licenses that the user has. Now we can see here that the user has 2 licenses, and both licenses are active. We can see that the user has the Enterprise Mobility plus Security E5 license, and the user also has the Office 365 E5 license as well. Now, the next thing I want to check is I want to be sure that the user can log in without requiring to do any multi-factor authentication, just to be sure that we have a neat setting that we can use properly. So I'll open an private browser window, and I'll go to office.com. I want to sign in into office.com as the user, and then I want to specify the password. So I sign in. And like we can see here, we signed in without any need to do any multi-factor authentication. So we have been able to confirm that the user has got the appropriate license, because there's no license specific information here warning us that the user does not have the appropriate license. We've also confirmed that the user does not require multi-factor authentication, because we've not set up the policy that enforces multi-factor authentication. So I'm going to sign out as this user. I want to be sure that we are fully signed out as the user. And then we are. I'll just go ahead and close this browser. So back to our Entra ID console, I want to go ahead and go to conditional access. So to go to where I'm going to set up conditional access, I'm going to, for example, go to identity again. And under identity, I want to expand protection. And this time around, I'll be selecting conditional access. Now, before we go on to create a new policy, I want to be sure that there is no policy existing. So I'll click on policies. And we can see here that there is no user-specific policy here. And the only policy we have is currently turned off. So this is a good platform for us to go ahead and check the settings that we're going to deploy in a minute. So I want to create a new policy. So I'll go ahead and click on New Policy. I'll give my policy a name, which I'll call MFA for Grady, for example. Now, I'll go ahead and give the policy a name. As you can see that the name field is asterisked in red, meaning that it's a setting that we've got to go ahead and put in place if we want to continue. So under assignments, I want to click on the link 0 users and groups selected. So I'll go ahead and click on the link, and it gives me a number of things I can do. We can see currently that the default here is none, because there is no user or group we have created a policy for. But we also have other options like all users. Now, when we click all users, something interesting happens. It tells us don't lock yourself out. This policy will affect all of your users, and we recommend applying a policy to a small set of users to verify that it behaves as we expect. And that is a very important recommendation. Now, you don't want to go ahead and create conditional access policies and just enable it for everyone, because it can have some really unexpected results. Even though you choose to enable it for all users, one thing you could do is you could choose to exclude specific users. So, for example, you may come and exclude, while you've enabled it for all users, you may come and select some exclusions or so. So I want to go ahead and enable it just for selected users and groups. Now, if I select selected users and groups, I've got to go ahead and configure it. I could, for example, enable it for guest users or external users, and it prompts me to select all kinds of users. For example, I can select B2B collaboration guests, local guest users, service provider users, and so on. I could go ahead and also specify conditional access for specific directory roles. We can see here that I have all kinds of directory roles. For example, application admin, and I can scroll all the way down and enable multi-factor authentication through conditional access for specific directory roles. And that may be a very good idea, specifically for some of the sensitive admin roles. You may want to enforce multi-factor authentication to ensure that the login process for those sensitive roles becomes much more secure. Now, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I want to enable multi-factor authentication for users and groups. Now, once I select users and groups, we have a flyout here asking me to select the specific user or the specific group that I want to enable multi-factor authentication for. So the user I want to enable multi-factor authentication for is the user Grady-Archie. So I'll scroll down, I'll select the user, and then I'll go ahead and click on select. Now, for target resources, I'll go ahead and click on, we can see here it tells us that no target resource is selected. So I'll go ahead and click on the link for target resources. So on the target resources here, we see we have none, same setting we had before. We had options to exclude and options to include. So I want to go ahead and, for example, if I go ahead and select all cloud apps again, it gives me that same warning we had before. Again, you don't want to enable MFA for all cloud apps. You usually would be prompted to, first of all, enable for selected apps. You do the testings, you do the fine-tuning, and you are sure that that's exactly what you want. And then you can go ahead and roll it out to more apps. So that is the recommended thing. So for this use case, I want to go ahead and click on select for a particular app. And in this case, I want to select for Office 365. So I'll go ahead and click on Office 365. And then I want to go ahead and click on select to enable multi-factor authentication just for Office 365. And then under there, I want to go ahead and click on the link for conditions. Now, in this case, of course, we have a number of conditions such as user risk. It's currently not configured. If I click on configure user risk, we can see if I click on yes, it prompts me to configure user risk levels needed for this policy to be enforced. We could have high risk, medium, or low risk. Under sign-in risk, if I click on configure, we have something similar again. Control access to respond to specific sign-in risk levels. If I click on yes, it prompts me to select the sign-in risk level that it will apply to, such as high, medium, low, or no risk. But specifically, what I want to set up is for locations. So I'll go ahead and click on locations. I'll go ahead and click on location. And I want to configure this policy. So I'll go ahead and click on yes. So I click on yes. And I want to control user access based on their physical location for any location. So that's what I want to do. So any location is what I want to configure the user access based on their location. So we have lots and lots of other settings that I can go ahead and configure as well right here. So we can do lots of things. So I can go ahead now and move on to the next setting, which is access control. So I'll go ahead and click on zero controls selected. Now, under access control here, we see control access enforcement to block or grant access. So under this, I want to be sure that grant access is selected, and I want to click on require multi-factor authentication. So I want to scroll all the way down and be sure that for multiple controls, require all the selected controls is what is obtainable. And yes, that is exactly what is obtainable. So I want to go ahead and click on select. So I think that is about all of the setting that I want to demonstrate with here. And under enable policy, we see that report only is the one that is currently selected. That means to go ahead and have the policy in place, but it's not enforced, but it's going to be giving you only reports. But I want to turn on the policy, so I'm going to select on, and then I'll go ahead and click on create, and that will tell us that it's creating the MFA for Grady policy. And under conditional access policies, we now see that the policy is now reflected. Another thing we want to take note of is that the policy is currently turned on. So we see the policy is on. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead now and test this policy to be sure that our policy works as we expect. So I'll open up a new in private window. So I'll go ahead and click on new window, and I'll go back to office.com. This time around, I want to sign in as Grady. So I'll go ahead and click on sign in. And it prompts me to sign in as the appropriate user. So I'll sign in. I'll specify the password of the user. And then I'll click on sign in. So now you can see here that before now, immediately we clicked on sign in, it signed us in. But because we have MFA enforced through conditional access policies, we can see that it tells us that your organization needs more information to keep your account secure. So what do we have to do here? It's prompting the user to choose an additional authentication factor. I remember the default authentication factor here is the something you know authentication factor. So what it is doing now is prompting us to add an additional authentication factor. So I'll go ahead and click on next. So it opens a page here, mysignins.microsoft.com, and it tells us that we can keep our account secure. It tells us that Microsoft, they're prompting us to use Microsoft Authenticator. So it tells us that on your phone, install the Microsoft Authenticator app. If you don't have it, you can download it now. After you install the Authenticator app on your device, you can choose on next. If you agree to use the authentication app, you can go ahead and click on I want to use a different authentication app if you don't want to use the Microsoft Authenticator app. So, but in this case, we want to use the Authenticator app. So I'll go ahead and click on next. And it tells me that I should set up my account. If you are prompted, allow notifications, then add an account and select work or school. So the next thing I want to do is I want to click on next. And then it prompts me to scan the QR code here. This QR code will connect the Microsoft Authenticator app with my account. Then after you scan on the QR code, you want to go ahead and click on next. So once you scan the QR code, you want to go ahead and click on next. And then it is going to have the QR code installed on your device. And then it's going to associate your account here with the details in the QR code. But let's see how we can use a different method. So I click on, I want to set up a different method. So I click on that. And it prompts me to choose a method I would like to use. So we can see here that we have, apart from the Authenticator app, we have the option to use a phone. So I'll go ahead and click on phone. And then I want to go ahead and click on confirm. Now, it opens yet another window here, and it tells us that I can provide who I can prove who I am by receiving a code on my phone, and it prompts me to choose what phone number I would like to use. So I go ahead and click on the country where I'm currently resident, or where my phone number is currently associated with. So I go ahead and choose the country. And then, of course, it prompts me to choose the phone number. I'll go ahead and click on next to choose the phone number. So it goes ahead to send the number to my phone. So, and I'll just go ahead and enter the number. So I'll go ahead and enter the number, which is 648245. And then I'll go ahead and click on next. And it tells me my verification is complete. My phone has been registered. So I'll go ahead and click on next. And it says, great job. You have successfully set up your security info. Choose done to continue to sign in. So I'm clicking on done. It prompts me that to sign in fully, I'll go ahead and, like before, we see I now have access to my account. So we can see that I have added a second factor to the authentication, and that has significantly improved the sign-in process for my account. So this is all we've got the time for today. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you learned something from this video. And if you've got any questions, like I said before, please drop your questions in the comment section. And of course, drop your comments as well. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.